over the course of 10 years now, we've been involved with helping everybody around the country put together their WFDS decisions. And for me, I got really interested in this idea of being like, okay, well, it's been 10 years. Like, what have we been talking about in all these decisions? So this project is sort of the beginning of reporting out on what does the 10 years worth of WFDS data tell us. And in particular, I'm focusing on the relative risk assessment data. All right, so I'm not going to talk about WFDS extremely briefly because Tanya covered that. I want to talk about the relative risk assessment. I want to show you, when we look at the relative risk assessment, how that information differs spatially across the United States, and then get a little bit more into what we're finding when land managers talk about elements of risk. Okay, so I'm going to skip this because Tanya was kind enough to go through this for us. So this is the relative risk assessment. Tanya talked about this. But I need to talk about it a little bit more so you understand the results I'm gonna talk to you about. So there's three main components that lead up into the relative risk assessment, and basically we're asking land managers to rate these different things as low, moderate, or high. And so they have to rate, time of season, is it early, moderate, or early, middle, or late, barriers. So they eventually get to a rating for probability, hazard, and values, and that all leads up to a final rating for relative risk. And so as Tanya mentioned, this can happen multiple times on a fire, but you have to have one done in order to include in your WFDS decision. So when I look at all the data over the course of from 2010 to 2017, this becomes a really good way of being like, well, what was the risk on your wildland fire? So we have this sort of snapshot of how people are talking about risk. Oh, the other thing that I'm going to get into is they also put these notes in here. And the notes aren't mandatory, but it's a way for them to say, hey, this is why I said late time of season, or this is why I said high severity. So there's this little justification on why they chose the ratings that they did. So this is our sample. We went through the WFDS data, and we pulled out 5,087 fires across all the geographic areas in the country. And because there's more than one relative risk done per fire, I chose the relative risk that happens with the greatest frequency. So what happens is sometimes you start with like a high relative risk, and then your fire evolves, and you say, oh, it's a moderate now, it's a moderate, oh, okay, now it's a low. So I would have chose the moderate because it would happen twice. I needed to choose one per fire so I could kind of keep it a sample, like a clean sample. So this is essentially what we're looking for the country. And so when I look at kind of all that data and I put together, how do you characterize risk, what we get is on the western side of the country, these are the geographic areas that seem to prefer or characterize their risk more as high more than anybody else, with the Northwest preferring high and moderate more than any other of the geographic areas in the country. And conversely, on the Southwest and the Eastern, seem to prefer low or moderate more than anyone else in the country. And then you have all these geographic areas in between, where you have Alaska, you see the Northern Rockies, I guess I don't have a little pointer here. So then you've got all the green ones. And they're a mix of going a lot of different ways, and we'll get into that here in a second. So I've got the Northwest, which is my most high geographic area. They choose high and moderate more than anyone. Then I've got the Southwest, which chooses low and moderate more than anyone. And then I've got the Northern Rockies. And here are all the little components that the land managers have to rate high, moderate, or low. So basically what this is showing you is the frequency of how often do they say high or moderate or low for all the things that they have to rate over the course from 2010 to 2017. So there's some interesting kind of signatures that come up. And one is that the Northern Rockies and the Northwest really share similar characterizations of seasonal severity. And that makes sense because they have this close geographic proximity to one another. But around 75 to 80% of the time, when they have to talk about their seasonal severity, they'll say high, very high, or extreme. Now, all the geographic areas seem to have some discussion of barriers. And barriers are going to become important because that's what I'm going to talk about for this talk. So I'm going to talk about how they rated it. So when they say moderate, that means they have some, and when they say low, that means they have many. And so what we find in the Northwest, which is my high GA, 20% of the time they're saying many, and Northern Rockies, which is our good moderate, about 30%, and then the Southwest about 40%. But everybody seems to have some barriers on the landscape. And when I say barriers, I'm not talking about social or ecological barriers. I'm talking about like rocky ridges or roads or trails, like physical barriers. And then finally, values. This is really interesting because this really makes the Northern Rockies very unique against all the other geographic areas. Is the Northern Rockies rates their values, all the sub-elements for values, as low to moderate almost more than anyone else. And in particular, when they have to say, do we have high, moderate, or low natural, cultural, or infrastructure values, over 50% of the time they're saying low. And it doesn't mean there's nothing out there. It means that, well, I don't know exactly what that means, but what I think that could mean is two things. Either there are things out there and land managers know how to mitigate against the adverse effects to these values at risk, or it could mean that we have a lot of natural resources out there, but we think fire is going to interact in a good way with those resources, so I'm going to say low and we're going to move on. So interestingly, the Northern Rockies and Alaska are very similar in their perspective of how they rate values. And also more similar to the Southwest, who also seems to go low to moderate for their values ratings. Okay, so I want to get to the next part of this. So we went through all those frequency ratings and we got this sort of idea of like how are different geographic areas characterizing risk. But now what we wanted to do is actually go through these notes. And to do this, I borrowed methods from social scientists. So what we're doing here is we're essentially reading all these qualitative texts, and then we develop these codes. And every single time somebody talks about, you know, the fires burning in grass and chaparral, I make a note that, okay, the fuels, what was talked about here is grass or shrub fuels. And so we go through the notes and we build up this frequency of how often people are talking about these different concepts. I didn't do this for all the fires. I did it for a stratified random sample of 20% of the fires for the Northwest and the Southwest, and I'm only going to talk about the Southwest. But here's what the sample looks like for the 20% of fires. This is a pretty arduous process to do this, so I had to constrain the sample so I could actually get done with it. Okay, so what are people talking about? So for this, I'm talking about the probability notes, and overwhelmingly, this is for the Southwest, and what they're talking about when they're talking about probability is the number one thing is they're talking about the monsoon. But then after that, what they're talking about is barriers, and they talk about barriers in a lot of different ways. They talk about natural barriers, which is barriers that are from like changes in fuel type, riparian areas, rocky ridges. They talk about unnatural barriers, so like roads or trails. They talk about barriers being numerous, but they talk about barriers from fires. And they also talk about barriers from prescribed fires with a pretty high frequency. So I wanted to look a little bit more into that. And what we find is out of the 149 fires that I went through with the relative risk, 41 of them are mentioned something about barriers from fires. So that's about 28% of the sample. And of those 41 fires, 19 are associated with low relative risk. So we're starting to make a connection with the fact that we have barriers on the landscape from previous fires, and we're also starting to be able to say, okay, you know what, our relative risk is now low. When I look at the other codes that are associated with barriers, we find references to the monsoon and precipitation, and references to unnatural barriers, but also references to low fire behavior. And so for an example, when I talk about when I'm coding this would be an example of a barrier from fires. So the fire area has not burned in recent history, but it's surrounded by numerous areas that have burned in wildfires or prescribed fires in the last 5 years. Or this one, most threats to private lands in the Northeast were mitigated by the Eagle Rock Fire in 2010. So here you see evidence of the Southwest land manager talking about, we had this fire in 2010, we had these values, but we have this fire barrier, so it's okay. And subsequently, they can say low relative risk for that fire. Okay, the other thing that I did is I went and I looked through evidence of them talking about what I call these fire management concepts. And this isn't explicitly asked in the relative risk assessment, but because these ideas are so connected to risk, people talk about them. And specifically what I'm looking for here is evidence of them talking about a suppression strategy or evidence of them talking about something other than a full suppression strategy. And so what we find in the Southwest, they still talk about suppression about 17% of the time, but they also talk about something other than suppression about 16% of the time. And when they're not talking about suppression, they're usually rating their fires as either moderate or low. So what's an example of a suppression code? It would be the top. So the fire's holding at 130 acres, we've got resources, we've contained it, we're in mop-up stage. That clearly communicates that this was a suppression fire. Conversely, other strategies doesn't necessarily mean it's monitoring and they're walking away. In this example, what I see is evidence of them thinking about using fire to achieve multiple objectives. So I throw that into the other strategies code, and so that's sort of how I define that. Okay, so when we take all the data together, and there's more analysis that went into this that I did not talk about here, but what we came up with was this sort of conceptual model of what is driving risk in strategy. And so what we find is climate really sets the pattern for the beginning of this, and then climate is going to impact weather. And then we have barriers. We have barriers ubiquitously, sorry. They're everywhere. They're everywhere on the landscape. And then we have fuel condition and fire behavior. And interestingly, values are important, but they don't dominate. They don't dominate the dialogue that you think as you think they would. So I have that as a smaller component to this. And these are the things that are going to influence the risk and then the chosen strategy. So when I apply this to the Southwest, what we see is the Southwest benefits from having this North American monsoon. And because they have the monsoon, that leads them to have two things in place. One is sporadic precipitation, and the other is they seem to have a good understanding of where they are in their fire season. We know from looking at the codes that they have a lot of barriers on their landscapes, and in part they have barriers from fires and prescribed fires. And all these things sort of lead them to have low fuel condition and low fire behavior. They rate their values as low, and so that leads them to have low to moderate risk, and then they have the ability to be able to use strategies other than full suppression, which essentially reinforces them to have more barriers and then continue to use other strategies. So what we're starting to see in the Southwest, or at least evidence from the way land managers are talking about this in the relative risk assessment, is their investment in using fires and prescribed fires are now, we're starting to see evidence of them being able to have more decision space now because of that investment. And so why is that relevant for the Northern Rockies? Well, I didn't look through the notes for the Northern Rockies, but what I would expect is that because of the investment in the number of fire scars here in the Bob, you also would have that same set of factors working in your favor, where because you've got this investment in barriers, when you get these breaks in weather, you're going to have more decision space to work with what you want to do with that fire, on how you want to manage different flanks of those fires. So I forgot to acknowledge my co-author, who's also my advisor. His name's Carl Seelstad, and Carl is a associate professor at the National Center of Landscape Fire Analysis at the University of Montana. He's also a Type 3 IC and a former smoke jumper at McCall, and so he's been really, really great in helping to put the fire management perspective on this. And I should also note that this is still a work in progress, so if you have any kind of questions or ideas, I'd appreciate some feedback.
I was just curious if there was any influence of, you know, if it's multi-jurisdictional, if there's evidence of, you know, some jurisdictions' values or having the most influence over
Yes.
what was reflected?
Yes. Yeah, there is actually, and I don't think I've got it in this slideshow, but, and I didn't talk about it for this talk, but we can definitely see when we look at how different agencies characterize their risk. Some agencies seem to go choose low, and some agencies seem to choose high. And what's interesting is when you zoom down to an actual jurisdictional level, you can see like this little bubble of the Park Service, and they're like light green, and they're surrounded by a sea of red. And you would have to think, like, there's got to be a different emission. There's got to be an issue of missions there, right? They have a different marching order, so therefore they sit. I'm just communicating the trends at this point. I haven't been able to really figure out, you know, what's the cause.